Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really immersing ourselves in some pretty heavy source material.
It's putting it mildly.
Yeah, it's attempting, well, basically a unified theory of everything, isn't it? From creation's start to the ultimate end game.
Mm-hmm.
And it connects these huge cosmic truths directly back to, the struggles you face every single day.
Right. It's definitely not light reading or listening.
Not at all. It's a deep exploration into, well, divine authority, how sin actually works, and this idea of sacrifice, but on a level that's maybe different than we usually think. More about relational pain.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're really tracking three, let's say, monumental concepts that these sources lay out.
Okay, what are they?
First, we've got to get a handle on the cosmic endgame, like the actual timeline of Christ's reign. They call him the second God here, and the specifics of how space-time gets handed over to the first God.
Okay, the handover. Got it. What's second?
Second, we dive deep into, well, our own spiritual wiring, you could say. It's about dissecting the huge difference between just religious effort, works, and what the sources call authentic, heart-led obedience.
That's a classic tension, effort versus obedience.
It is. And the sources have a very particular take on it.
And the third concept. You said it requires a shift in perspective.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
It asks us to look beyond just the physical suffering on the cross.
Okay.
We need to try and understand the relational agony involved. The sources suggest, quite radically, that the son's deepest pain wasn't his own suffering, surprisingly.
What was it then?
It was the pain he knew he was causing the Father, by forcing that separation, that divine turning away, because of the sin he was bearing.
Wow, okay. That is a different angle.
It really is.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to take these, profound insights about God's authority, temptation, sacrifice, and try to translate them into something useful, something actionable for you, the learner.
Because this framework, it really does challenge some basic ideas we might have about free will, what it means to own something, even our own lives, and just how much effort is actually needed to follow this path.
Absolutely. It gets right down to the foundations.
Okay, let's unpack this. And the sources start us right at the end, don't they? With the cosmic conclusion. So the sources jump straight into what feels like the most dramatic event possible, this total, unavoidable submission of everything under the second God's authority.
Yeah, no easing into it.
No. They go right to 1 Corinthians, establishing what they call Christ's triumphant reign, or even the must reign.
Right, and the emphasis there is on must. This isn't presented as just a hopeful prediction. It's framed as a cosmic necessity, a decree.
From 1 Corinthians 15.25.
Exactly. It states very clearly that Christ must reign until every single enemy, and every single one, is placed under his feet.
Like a conquest.
Very much so. The sources emphasize the sort of political and absolute nature of it. It's portrayed as a forceful dismantling of all opposition. Doesn't matter if it's visible, invisible, spiritual, physical.
It all has to go.
It all has to be subjected. It's painted as the essential first step, the prerequisite for the whole redemptive plan to actually succeed.
And when we think enemies, we might think spiritual forces, demons, that kind of thing. But the sources point to one specific final enemy.
Yes, and this is crucial for understanding the completion point. The last enemy that gets abolished, according to 1 Corinthians 15.26, is death itself.
Death, the ultimate consequence.
Right. That's the final victory marker within this current space-time setup. Death came from sin, from the curse on creation. So abolishing death means completely undoing the effects of the fall.
And this reign is possible because he already has the authority.
That's the idea. The sources stress he already holds what they term cosmic accountability. It's based on 1 Corinthians 15.27, which says all things have been put in submission under him. It's a present reality leading to a future completion.
But there's a crucial exception mentioned right there in the text, isn't there? A qualification about who isn't subject to him.
Exactly. And this is key for understanding the divine hierarchy presented. The text explicitly adds, almost like a parenthesis, that the only exception to this universal submission is the one who subjected everything to the Son.
Which is the first God.
Which is the first God. The sources really lean on this point to solidify the first God's position as the ultimate, unsubjected authority. It sets the stage perfectly for the next major event, the transition.
Okay, so this reign reaches its necessary end. The enemies are gone, death is abolished. We arrive at the moment of ultimate transition, the end of the kingdom and the white throne. What happens now?
Well, this transition is huge, theologically speaking. It's laid out in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 24 and 28. Once everything is finally subjected, the Son, the second God, performs this ultimate act of submission.
He submits himself.
He submits himself to the Father, the first God.
Even after reigning over everything. Why? What's the purpose of that final step?
The purpose is stated very clearly in the text. It happens so that the first God can be all in all.
Man.
Meaning the ultimate, absolute Lord over everything with no intermediary layers, you could say. The sources see this as the Son completing his specific job description within the system of time and space.
Like his executive role is finished.
Precisely. He acted as the king, the judge, the redeemer within this created order. Now that the task is done, he formally hands back the authority that's structured and operated within space-time. It's a fulfillment, then a return.
Okay, but before that final handover, there's a specific period described in Revelation, right? Set in the new heaven and new earth, the 1,000-year rule.
Yes, the sources detail this period. It's the promised time of co-reigning.
Who reigns with him?
Revelation 20, verse 6, identifies them as the bride or priests, specifically pointing to martyrs, those who take part in what's called the first resurrection. They reign with Christ for that 1,000 years.
And this isn't just symbolic.
No, the sources interpret it as a literal, physical, governmental role. They rule alongside Christ from the New Jerusalem, overseeing the restored creation during this millennium. It's presented as a time of visible divine justice, peace, and restoration on earth.
And what marks the end of that 1,000-year period?
The closing event for, well, humanity and the cosmos as we understand it, the ultimate judgment.
The Great White Throne.
That's the one. Revelation 20, verse 11 describes it. This is the final accounting, determining the fate of everyone who wasn't part of that first resurrection. Once that judgment is complete, the whole process is finished. Redemption history, governing, judging, it's all wrapped up.
Which brings us finally to the handover itself. How do the sources describe that moment? Is it ceremonial? Is it instantaneous?
They describe it as the formal conclusion of the second God's specific mission within creation. He takes the entire finished product, the subjected, judged, perfected space-time reality, and presents it, almost like a completed masterpiece, back to the first God.
And this act is both submission and presentation.
Yes. It marks the end of the Son's role as the, let's say, executive agent managing space-time. His assigned task is complete.
And then, what? What happens after the handover? Do the sources give us any hints, any post-time speculation?
This is where the sources show a kind of theological restraint, which is interesting. They state very clearly that Scripture just doesn't record what happens after this point.
We hit a wall.
We hit the limit of what's been revealed. However, the author does offer a personal, qualified belief.
Which is?
That after this temporal role is completed, the second God will, in essence, resume his state of equality with the first God, stepping back outside the functional submission that was required for the cosmic project.
You said qualified. How so?
Yes, and this is critical. The author immediately adds that this belief is just the thought of someone within space-time, looking outwards, as it were.
Acknowledging the limitation.
Exactly. It underscores the deep mysteries surrounding the eternal nature of the Godhead. Any guess we make about the state after time ends is inherently limited by our being in time.
That limitation actually leads perfectly into the next crucial point the sources make about the second God's nature relative to creation. The second God in space-time. If he can hand over time, what's his actual relationship to it?
Well, the sources reaffirm a fundamental point of Christology here. The second God, Christ, only appears to be a creature or limited when he's operating within the rules of space-time.
But his true nature transcends it.
Completely. Colossians 1.1c is key here. It says, all things were created through him and for him, visible and invisible. He's the creator. Space-time is the created thing, the mechanism he built.
That distinction is huge. It changes how we have to think about his life on Earth, doesn't it? The sources talk about the relativity of time-space from his perspective.
And the imagery used is just staggering. It really tries to convey the scale difference.
Like the Isaiah passage.
Yeah, Isaiah 40.15. It says, the nations are like a drop in a bucket, like a tiny speck of dust on weighing scales. From the perspective of the eternal second God, all of human history, all our striving, all of time itself, it's almost insignificant in scale.
Nothingness, even.
The first God views the nations as nothing, empty. That perspective. Well, it makes his decision to enter that drop in the bucket even more profound.
Right. Because if our reality is like a speck of dust to him, then choosing to enter it wasn't just a visit. The sources argue it required the sustained, almost unbelievable effort from him.
An effort to maintain his divinity while playing by the rules of the very system he created.
And why was that effort so necessary?
Because, according to the sources, he didn't just visit. He took on the very thing that defines our struggle within this system, cursed flesh.
Which is the perfect bridge to our next section, the internal battle. Okay, so we're shifting focus now from the vast cosmic scale down to the intimate internal battle against sin that defines the human condition. And the sources ground this discussion first in the origin of sin.
Yeah, they go straight to the book of James, which gives this really clear, almost mechanical explanation of how temptation works, and crucially, where God stands in relation to it.
What's the foundational rule here?
The absolute bedrock theological premise, according to James 1.13 of the sources, is this: God does not tempt, and he cannot be tempted by evil. Period.
So God is completely separate from the process of temptation itself.
Completely separate from originating it or being susceptible to it.
Yeah.
This establishes God's perfect nature and rules out any idea that he's the author of evil, even though he allows its consequences to play out within the space-time he created.
Okay, so if God isn't the source of temptation, then it has to come from within us. What's the human mechanism described in James?
James 1.14 gives us what the sources describe as almost a reproductive cycle of sin. It says sin happens when a person is lured and enticed by their own desire, their own lust.
Lust. The sources used a specific term.
Yes, they highlighted the strong Korean word yukshim, which isn't just sexual lust, but covers greed, covetousness, selfish ambition, basically, any powerful self-centered desire. And the key is, it's ours. It arises internally.
And there's a progression, a cycle.
A very clear, almost fatalistic three-stage process described in James 1.14-15. Stage 1, desire, yokshim, when it's conceived, when we give into it internally, brings forth sin, the act or internal choice.
Okay.
Stage 2, sin, when it's fully grown, when it becomes a pattern or reaches its conclusion, brings forth death, spiritual and ultimately physical separation.
It's an internal engine leading to destruction.
Exactly. And the sources hammer this point. The process starts entirely within the individual's own will, their own yokshim. We aren't forced into sin from outside. We're drawn away by what's already inside us.
This internal origin of sin sets up the massive question for the incarnation, Christ in cursed flesh. If sin comes from yokshim and Christ became human, what did that mean for his physical existence?
This is maybe the most challenging part of the source material's framework. They state, based on passages like Hebrews 2.14, that Christ willingly, intentionally, took on cursed flesh.
Cursed flesh. What does that mean practically?
It means he didn't just get a perfect, idealized human body. He took on flesh that was subject to the consequences of the fall. When Adam sinned, the ground was cursed, thorns and thistles. The sources connect this metaphorically to the human body itself after the fall.
So the body inherently has tendencies, inclinations.
Yes, inclinations towards things like fatigue, hunger, pain, anger, the desire for comfort, self-preservation, what Paul wrestles with in Romans 7. The sources suggest these thorns and thistles are the physical and emotional desires inherent in the cursed flesh, which constantly present opportunities for yokshim to arise.
So Christ felt all that, the pull towards ease, the frustration, the physical needs.
Absolutely. According to this view, that's the only way he could truly be tempted. This is the source of his genuine vulnerability and empathy, which Hebrews 4.15 highlights. He says he was tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin.
Tempted in every way implies the desires, the thorns and thistles were really there. He felt them.
They had to be, for the temptation to be real. Otherwise, it's just play acting. He experienced the full spectrum of human physical and emotional inclination that stems from the curse on flesh.
Okay, but here's the critical question then. If the structure of cursed flesh naturally leads towards yokshim and sin unless it's actively fought against, how did Christ stay sinless for over 30 years?
This is where the sources make a claim that might sound surprising, even controversial. They argue he had to engage in the daily fight.
It's a fight against his own body.
In a manner of speaking, yes, against the desire stemming from his flesh. The sources point to his constant prayer life, like in Luke 22.39. His habit was to go to the Mount of Olives to pray. And Paul's language in 1 Corinthians 9.25 about athletes exercising self-control, about disciplining his body to keep it under control.
So Christ had to actively exert effort to subdue his body's inclinations.
That's the assertion.
Yeah.
That he ran his race with purpose, he disciplined his body. And here's the really strong claim the sources make, based on this structure. If he had failed to exert this continuous conscious effort,
yes,
he would have sinned. Because that's the established structure of space-time he himself set up. Cursed flesh naturally produces temptation, yokshim, and yokshim, if not subdued by the will, inevitably leads to sin.
Hold on, that sounds potentially problematic. If he's divine, the second God, couldn't his divinity just sort of automatically prevent sin? Why the need for effort? Wouldn't failure be impossible anyway?
This is where the source's logic gets really interesting and maybe challenging. They argue that for his divinity to simply override the system would negate the whole point of the incarnation.
How so?
It would mean he wasn't truly living under the conditions he came to redeem. It would undermine the very rules of space-time that he, as creator, established. The rule is, cursed flesh generates desires that tempt the will. If he enters that system, he subjects himself to that rule.
So his divinity didn't act like a safety net.
Not in the sense of bypassing the rules. Instead, his divinity manifested as the perfect, unwavering will to exert the necessary effort, to always choose obedience, to always subdue the flesh's desires through love for the Father. His divinity fueled the fight. It didn't negate the need for it.
Wow. Okay, so his life wasn't one of serene detachment, but potentially one of continuous, active, internal struggle against the natural grain of his physical existence.
That's the picture they paint. Which then leads us to the seeming paradox, the impossibility of Christ's sin. If effort was required, and failure hypothetically could lead to sin within the structure, why do we also say he was incapable of sinning? As 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, he knew no sin.
Right. How do those two ideas fit together?
The sources argue the defining difference wasn't the absence of temptation or physical desire. The cursed flesh guaranteed those were present. The difference was in his will.
His will.
The will towards sin, the internal choice to embrace yoksham, to pursue self-desire over God's desire, that faculty, that inclination of the will, was completely absent in him.
And why was it absent? What drove his will instead?
One thing, love. The sources identify love as the engine.
Love for the Father.
Perfect, absolute, unwavering love for the Father. John 15:12 talks about his love. John 14:31 shows his motive is to do exactly what the Father commanded, demonstrating his love. This love, the sources argue, was so overwhelming, so total, it completely dominated and subjugated any competing desire arising from the flesh. Romans 8:1, living according to the Spirit, which for him was inherent, sets one free from the law of sin and death.
So the love essentially made the option of choosing sin unthinkable, unappealing.
Utterly impossible on a character level. His perfect will, fueled by perfect love, simply rendered the choice for yoksham obsolete and repulsive to him.
To really hammer home this point that sin is about the will's choice, not just the body's condition, the sources use a powerful counterexample.
Yes, the Hellel counterpoint. Hellel being the Hebrew name often associated with Lucifer or Satan before his fall.
It's in passages like Ezekiel 28.
Exactly. Ezekiel 28 verses 15 and 17 describe this being Hellel as created perfect, blameless, walking among the fiery stones, adorned with beauty. Crucially, he had no cursed flesh. He was the pinnacle of creation.
And yet
he sinned. Why? Because pride, yoksham for status and self-exaltation, arose in his heart. His beauty led to vanity.
So perfect body, no curse, but still chose sin because of internal will, because of yoksham.
Precisely. The sources use this as the ultimate proof. Sin originates in the will's turn toward self-desire, completely independent of whether the body is cursed or perfect. It's a choice of the heart.
So putting the two together, Hellel, perfect form, no struggle, chose sin out of pride. Christ, cursed flesh, constant struggle, chose obedience out of love.
It makes the defining factor crystal clear. The orientation of the will, driven either by self-love, yoksham, or by love for God.
Which leads to that paradoxical conclusion you mentioned earlier.
For Christ, according to this framework, obedience, though requiring immense constant effort against the flesh, was ultimately easier than sinning.
Easier.
Because his entire being, his will, was so consumed by love for the Father that the alternative, choosing yoksham, was fundamentally alien and impossible for him. The effort was real, the struggle against fleshly desire was real, but the outcome sinlessness was guaranteed by the perfect love driving his will.
Okay, we've just established something pretty counterintuitive. Even for the sinless second God, operating within space-time meant continuous, necessary effort to subdue the desires of cursed flesh.
Right. The divinity didn't bypass the struggle. It empowered the victory within the struggle.
So that immediately throws a spotlight on our effort, doesn't it? If he needed effort, what about us? How do we square the need for our own spiritual fight with the clear biblical teaching that works human effort can't save us?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources tackle it head-on, starting with a firm reminder. Why effort isn't works in the negative sense. Meaning, we have to start by reaffirming the absolute baseline. Salvation cannot, under any circumstances, come through keeping the law or through our own religious efforts. Galatians 3:21 is crystal clear. If a law could give life, righteousness would indeed have been by the law. But it can't.
So trying harder, being more religious, checking off boxes, that doesn't earn salvation.
Absolutely not. The sources are emphatic. Any effort aimed at earning favor or achieving righteousness on our own is completely futile. That's works in the Galatian sense, and it fails.
Okay, if our effort can't save us, but effort is needed to fight sin, as we saw with Christ, where does the ability to make the right kind of effort come from? This seems to be where grace and will intersect.
Exactly. The ability to fight, the very desire to push back against yokesham, is presented as a direct result of grace.
How so?
The sources argue, citing 1 John 4:0, love consists in this. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son. That the will to fight sin, the motivation to even want to subdue selfish desire, only exists because of Christ's sacrifice. His love enables our responsive love and will.
So grace provides the motivation, the want to.
And the power. The sources also point to the necessity of the Holy Spirit dwelling within us, based on the new covenant promises in Hebrews 8:8-10, putting laws into minds and writing them on hearts. It's the Spirit who enables that deeper internal obedience, like actually loving your neighbor from the heart, not just externally.
So our moral effort isn't earning grace. It's enabled by grace. It's a response.
Precisely. It's fueled by a divine gift, not a human achievement.
And this grace does more than just enable our will. The sources say it also provides boundaries, the limitation of temptation.
Yes, this is another crucial aspect of how grace operates in this framework. They refer back to 1 Corinthians 10:1-13, the promise that God won't let us be tempted beyond what we can bear and will always provide a way out.
Why is that considered part of grace?
Because if the temptations were genuinely overwhelming, if the fight was rigged against us from the start, then the expectation that we should overcome would be unfair, even cruel. Grace ensures that the struggle, while real and difficult, is winnable. The way out is always there if we choose to take it.
Which brings us to a really interesting definition of grace presented in this material. It's not what we might typically think. It's the grace of choice, not compulsion.
Right. We often think of grace as God smoothing the path, removing the obstacles, maybe even making sin impossible in certain situations.
But the sources challenge that.
They do. They argue strongly that grace is not primarily about creating an environment where sinning is impossible.
Why not? Wouldn't that be the best kind of grace?
Because if sin were impossible, our choice would be meaningless. Our love wouldn't be a genuine response. It would be coerced, automatic. There'd be no real relationship, no real submission of the will.
So grace isn't about removing the possibility of failure.
It's about ensuring the possibility of success. Grace, in this view, is God creating the environment where we genuinely have a choice. It's the assurance, rooted in his power and presence through the Spirit, that if we choose to fight, if we engage with all our heart, we can overcome sin. Jude verse 3 talks about contending earnestly for the faith. Grace gives us the ability and the arena to contend.
So the choice remains real, the struggle remains real, but grace ensures we have the capacity to choose rightly and the strength to follow through.
Exactly. It preserves meaningful choice. They do mention examples like God intervening to physically prevent Abimelech from sinning with Sarah in Genesis 20, so direct prevention can happen. But the everyday ongoing grace is the environment of genuine, empowered choice.
This all leads us to the absolute core distinction in this section, the nuance, obedience versus works. Using the Korean terms sunjong versus hungwi. This seems critical for understanding everything we've just discussed.
It absolutely is. It's the key to differentiating between religious activity and genuine relationship with God.
So what's the operational difference, according to the sources?
Obedience, sunjong, is defined as an action, an effort, yes, but one that is motivated purely by love for the Creator and a genuine desire to submit your will to His. It's about the heart posture behind the action.
Okay, love and submission driving the effort. What about works?
Works, Hengui, is effort or religious performance done without that heart of submission. It might look identical on the outside, but the motivation is different. It could be driven by trying to earn merit, seeking approval from others, maintaining a religious image, fear of punishment, or just fulfilling a duty without love.
The action could be the same, praying, giving, following rules, but the why changes everything.
Completely. And because the outward action can look the same, the sources use case studies to illustrate the internal difference.
Like Abel versus Cain.
Right, source John 3:01 contrasts them. Both brothers brought an offering, performed the same religious act. But the source says Abel's was obedience, his son John. It was deemed righteous because it came from a heart of faith and submission, giving his best. Cain's was works, Hangwei, deemed evil because his heart wasn't right. The motivation was likely duty, comparison, or something other than love and submission. God looks at the heart.
That's a powerful example. What about Moses versus the Pharisees? This involves the law itself.
Another great contrast. Matthew 23 shows the Pharisees as masters of external religious hangui. They meticulously follow the letter of the law, tithing even tiny herbs like mint, dill, and cumin.
Impressive attention to detail.
Externally, yes. But Jesus condemns them because their hearts were far from God. They did it for show, for status. Matthew 23:3 says they preach but don't practice. They neglected the core principles: justice, mercy, faithfulness. Their actions were works. Moses, on the other hand, also followed the law, but the sources frame his adherence as sanjang, obedience flowing from a deep, often struggling, but ultimately loving relationship with God.
So following the rules isn't enough. The heart's posture is the differentiator.
It is. And perhaps the most poignant illustration is the one about giving. The contrast between the rich donors and the poor widow in Mark 12.
Ah, the widow's mites.
Exactly. The rich people put in large sums of money, impressive external hangui. Maybe motivated by wanting recognition, maybe just giving out of their abundance without real sacrifice. Then this poor widow comes and puts in 2 tiny copper coins. Jesus says she put in more than all the others.
More.
Because those 2 coins were everything she had to live on. Her act wasn't about the amount. It was about total surrender, complete trust, absolute submission flowing from love. It was pure sanjang. Her entire life was in that offering. The rich men's gifts were just works, a fraction of their surplus offered without that heart of total dependence and love.
So it's the totality of the heart's commitment expressed in the action that defines obedience.
That's the core idea. It's not about the size of the effort or the action itself, but the loving, submissive heart that motivates it.
Okay, so tying this part together, grace doesn't eliminate the need for effort in the Christian life. Far from it. But grace provides the desire, the will, and the power to direct that effort towards loving submission, sanjang, rather than self-justifying performance. And it's that transformation of motive that makes the effort count as true obedience.
You've got it. That's the crucial distinction the sources are making.
We're now moving into what feels like the theological heart of the source material, the suffering of the second God. But the lens here is unique. It's focused less on physical endurance and more on, well, a relational crisis. We start at Gethsemane, the crisis of love.
Yes, it's Gethsemane. That moment of intense prayer in the garden before his arrest. It's often seen primarily as Christ wrestling with the fear of the immense physical pain and death he was about to face.
Praying for the cup to be removed, as Luke 22:42 says.
Exactly. And the sources acknowledge that on the surface, this could look like a moment where the flesh, the natural human desire for self-preservation, is really struggling, maybe even momentarily failing to be subdued.
But the sources argue strongly against that interpretation being the primary issue. They say the physical pain wasn't the true source of anguish.
They argue very strongly against it. In fact, they make the quite radical claim that the physical aspect of the crucifixion, while obviously horrific from our perspective, was not the core of his agony in Gethsemane or on the cross itself.
Not the core. How can they say that?
They suggest, based on passages like Isaiah 53:7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. That he faced the physical ordeal with a kind of transcendent resolve, almost seeing it as relatively light compared to the real horror.
So what was the real horror? What was the cup he was truly agonizing over?
The sources pinpoint the agony squarely on the imminent separation from the Father, the spiritual reality of bearing the sin of the world, as Galatians 3:13 says, becoming a curse for us, meant facing the Father's necessary turning away, the breaking of that perfect eternal communion. That was the unimaginable dread.
The relational breach.
The relational breach, that was the cup.
And this intense spiritual and relational agony helps explain the sheer extremity of the physical manifestation in the garden.
Precisely. When the core issue is this profound relational and spiritual trauma, the body reacts in extreme ways. The sources highlight Luke 22:44, which says, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground.
Hematidrosis.
Yes, a known, though rare, physiological response to extreme emotional distress and crisis. It signifies an agony far beyond just fear of physical pain. And furthermore, the source material connects this internal agony directly to his physical death. suggesting this overwhelming anguish literally caused his heart to rupture.
Based on the blood and water flowing from his side.
Based on John 19.34, yes. They interpret the separation of blood and water as medical evidence of cardiac rupture due to unbearable stress. The ultimate trauma wasn't the nails, it was the severing, even temporarily, of that perfect divine bond.
Yet even in the midst of this almost unimaginable agony, the sources stress his absolute willful submission to the curse. There was no real attempt to escape.
None whatsoever regarding the necessity of the act. Even in his distress, when Peter tries to defend him with a sword, Christ immediately shuts it down. He asks Peter, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" John 18.11.
He accepts it fully.
Fully. And he insists that the scriptures must be fulfilled. Matthew 26.53-54. There was never a doubt that this path, however agonizing, was the necessary and chosen one.
So the sources really view the cross not as some tragic necessity he had to endure, but as the specific intended purpose of his coming.
Absolutely. It wasn't plan B, it was the mission. Hebrews 2.9 says, "He was made lower than the angels so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone, and was crowned with glory because he suffered death." Colossians 1.20 says his purpose was to reconcile all things through the blood of his cross.
It was the goal.
It was the one definitive act that accomplished his purpose. And this reframes his prayer in Gethsemane. According to the sources, his loud cries and tears mentioned in Hebrews 5.7 were just prayers against the cup, but prayers for the strength to drink it fully, prayers to fulfill the Father's will, essentially praying for the curse he had to bear on our behalf. Luke 12:50 talks about the baptism he had to undergo and his distress until it was completed. It was a prayer towards the necessary agony.
Okay, this leads us to what you flagged earlier as the most counterintuitive and challenging claim in this material. We usually focus on Christ's suffering, his feeling of abandonment, but the sources argue the primary pain, the deeper pain, was actually the Father's suffering. How does that work?
It's a radical shift in focus, yes. It stems entirely from the concept of the perfect relational intimacy between the Father and the Son. Based on scriptures like John 3.35, the Father loves the Son and has placed everything in his hands. And Christ's own claims of unity with the Father, like John 10.30, I and the Father are one. If that bond is perfect, absolute, completely loving, then the greatest pain isn't your own suffering, but causing suffering to the one you love perfectly.
Like empathy amplified infinitely.
Exactly. Think about it in human terms, though imperfectly. If you love someone deeply, seeing them in pain because of something you have to do, even if it's necessary, can be more agonizing than your own discomfort. Christ, knowing the Father's perfect love for him, understood the immense grief and, well, divine cost it took for the Father to pour out wrath on sin, which his beloved Son was bearing.
So the second God understood the Father's perspective, the pain involved in not sparing his own Son, as Romans 8.32 puts it.
Precisely. The sources draw that, powerful though indirect, parallel to Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. The focus often goes to Isaac's fear, but the text emphasizes Abraham's agony, the cost to the father figure in offering up his beloved promised son. Christ, in his perfect unity with the Father, felt the weight of the Father's necessary judgment, the horror of the Father having to turn away his face.
So then that famous cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27.46. It's not just about his own feeling of abandonment.
The sources interpret it as encompassing more than just his own subjective experience of separation. It's also seen as a cry reflecting the unbearable weight of the entire relational catastrophe unfolding. It echoes his experiencing the pain of the Father having to forsake him.
Bearing the Father's grief in a way.
In a way, yes, because deep love desires to absorb the suffering of the beloved. The sources use that tragic analogy of King David's cry over his rebellious son Absalom in 2 Samuel 18.33. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." It's that desire of love to take the other's pain onto oneself. The second God, in perfect love, felt the agony caused to the Father by his necessary act of becoming sin for us.
So that knowledge that his obedience was inflicting the deepest possible wound on the one he loved most perfectly, that, according to these sources, was the ultimate crushing agony of the cross.
That's the core argument. It transforms the crucifixion from solely an act of substitutionary suffering for us into an event of profound mutual relational suffering within the Godhead itself, undertaken out of love for creation. Okay, so we've journeyed from the cosmic endgame through the mechanics of sin and grace to the very heart of divine relational suffering on the cross. Now, the sources insist we must bring these massive truths directly to the practical day-to-day life required of us, the creatures living within this space-time reality.
Back down to earth, basically.
Right back down to earth. And the starting point is simple, but demanding. understanding the cost of discipleship.
The logic seems clear. If the teacher, the second God, walked a path of total submission culminating in the cross, then the disciple must follow that same path. John 13:13, he is teacher and Lord, so we should do as he did.
And the sources pull no punches about what that path entails.
Yeah.
They lay out the radical requirements for discipleship based on Jesus' own words.
Like what?
Like denying yourself, taking up your cross daily, and following him. Luke 9:23-24. And even more starkly, the requirement to, in comparison, hate your own life, your family, father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, and even your possessions if you want to be his disciple. Luke 14:26-33.
That word hate is obviously provocative. It means relative value, right? Love for Christ has to be so absolute that all other loves and allegiances look like hate by comparison.
Exactly. It's not about literal emotional hatred. It's about the absolute priority. It signifies a complete abandonment of self-ownership and the claim that these other things, life, family, stuff, are the ultimate priority or belong ultimately to us.
Total allegiance.
Total allegiance. And the sources emphasize the consequence of not maintaining this radical commitment. Jesus says if you don't carry your cross and follow, you cannot be his disciple. And if the salt loses its saltiness, its radical distinctiveness, it's useless, fit only to be thrown out. Luke 14:34-35. The standards are absolute because, the sources imply, the nature of reality under God demands it.
This idea of abandoning ownership connects directly to a really unique metaphor the sources use, exhaling the forbidden fruit. What do they mean by that?
This is a fascinating concept they developed. They argue that true discipleship is essentially about undoing the original sin at its root.
And the root wasn't just eating fruit.
No, the acts symbolize something deeper. The sources say the core of the original sin was accepting the delusion of ownership. When Adam and Eve took the fruit against God's command, they were essentially saying, this knowledge, this choice, this resource, it's mine now. I will be like God, determining good and evil for myself. I own my destiny. They took possession of what was only ever lent to them by the Creator.
And the consequence of inhaling that fruit, of accepting that delusion, is that we live our lives based on it.
Yes, we live as if we are the owners. The sources point to the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12. He has a great harvest and thinks, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. It's all I and my.
Because he believes he owns it all. His time, his life, his stuff.
Exactly. And Romans 14:7 says, for none of us lives to himself alone. But if we believe our life is ours, we will live for ourselves. That's the natural consequence of the forbidden fruit delusion.
So to exhale the forbidden fruit means rejecting that delusion.
It means consciously recognizing reality. It's acknowledging the truth that nothing we have is actually ours. Our time, our talents, our possessions, our relationships, our very next breath. It all belongs entirely to the first God, the Creator.
Like King David's prayer.
Precisely. 1 Chronicles 29:14. But who am I, and who are my people, that we should be able to offer as willingly as this? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. It's recognizing we are stewards, just borrowing everything. Job 41:1 asks, who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. We simply cannot claim ownership against the Creator.
And living in that reality, acknowledging God's total ownership, leads to the result, transformation.
Because if you truly believe, down to your core, that everything belongs to God, you will naturally stop living for yourself. Your life will be lived for God, the true owner. Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God.
And this understanding also reframes the daily struggle against sin we talked about earlier.
It does. The fight becomes easier, in a sense, when the motivation shifts from protecting my interests or fulfilling my desires, Yokshim rooted in ownership, to simply obeying the rightful owner out of love, Sunjong rooted in stewardship. The desire to please the owner can overwhelm the desire for self-possession.
This all seems to culminate in one inescapable conclusion about our place in the universe, the creature's non-possession.
That's the bottom line, repeated from the creature's perspective. We own nothing. Everything is lent. Our status as created beings inherently limits us.
And the sources give specific, concrete examples of these limitations that prove we don't own even the basics.
Yes, 3 really stark ones. First, life itself, Matthew 6:27. Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? We don't own our time. We can't extend it.
We can't control our lifespan. What's second?
Death, Hebrews 9:27. just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment. We cannot avoid the appointment of death or the accountability that follows. We don't own our exit strategy.
We can't escape the consequences of being creatures in time. And third,
Time and space themselves. Jeremiah 23:23-24 asks, "Am I only a God nearby, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Do not I fill heaven and earth?" And Job 38:4 asks Job where he was when God laid the earth's foundation. We are contained within time and space. We don't control them. We don't transcend them. God does.
okay, so if we own absolutely nothing and the Creator owns absolutely everything and has all authority, like Matthew 28:9 says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, what is the primary command he gives to creatures in this position?
It boils down to something remarkably simple yet profound, given our non-ownership status. The command is relational. Love one another.
John 15:12, my command is this, love each other as I have loved you. And John 13:34, the new command.
Exactly. If we own nothing, our lives cannot be about acquisition or self-protection. They must be defined by relationship, our relationship vertically with the Creator who owns all, and horizontally with fellow creatures who also own nothing. Love, expressed in sacrificial action, becomes the only valid currency, the only act that counts as true obedience, Sunjong, within this framework.
And what is the final implication, according to the sources, for refusing this central command? For choosing not to love, choosing instead to live as if we do own things?
The consequence is presented as stark and direct, simple death. Spiritual separation. John 3:35-36 says, "The Father loves the Son and placed everything in his hands, and whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on them."
Rejecting the Son means rejecting his command to love, rejecting the reality of God's ownership.
It means clinging to the forbidden fruit, living in the delusion of self-possession. And in this system, refusing to acknowledge the owner and follow his primary command inevitably results in separation from the source of life itself. #tag outro. So just to try and pull these massive threads together, we covered a lot today. We started way out on the cosmic scale, looking at the absolute certainty of Christ's final reign, the timeline involving the end of death, his ultimate submission, and that final handover of the perfected space-time back to the first God.
Right, the big picture conclusion. Then we zoomed right in, didn't we? Into the mechanics of sin, how it arises from our own yokesham, our selfish desire, and how even Christ, in cursed flesh, needed constant effort, fueled by love, to remain sinless.
Which led us to that crucial distinction between mere religious works, hangui, and true obedience. Sunjong actions that might look the same externally, but are radically different inside, depending on whether they're driven by love and submission or by something else.
And then the really challenging part. Rethinking the agony of the cross, seeing it less as physical pain and more as this profound relational suffering, the Son, experiencing the horror of the necessary separation from the Father, and even bearing the weight of the Father's grief in that moment.
Exactly. A suffering rooted in perfect love within the Godhead.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway for you, the listener? The source material seems to be arguing that the entire setup of the universe, the way space-time works, is almost designed to expose our deepest flaw. That tendency to grab, to possess, to live under the delusion of the forbidden fruit, that we are the owners.
Right. And our efforts, our struggles, our religious activities, they don't earn us anything on their own. They only become true obedience, Sunjong, when they flow from a heart that recognizes God's total ownership and acts out of love for Him, the Creator. Recognizing that everything we have, even the will to fight sin, is just a gift we're stewarding.
It reframes everything.
It really does. So let's end with this final provocative thought, drawing directly from the sources and connecting that idea of Christ's effort with our own reality. If the second God, the eternal Creator who exists outside space-time, found it necessary, when He entered our reality and took on cursive flesh, to engage in continuous, intense effort, agonizing prayer, and constant vigilance to subdue the flesh's desires. Knowing that failure wasn't just a personal slip-up, but would undermine the entire purpose of creation and redemption.
Okay.
Then what does that reality imply about the kind of essential, daily, moment-by-moment struggle required for us? For creatures who actually start with a bent toward yokesham, living within this structure.
Yeah, what does it imply?
It seems to imply that sustained, conscious, heart-motivated effort against sin and self-ownership isn't just an optional extra for the really spiritual. It's the fundamental, non-negotiable requirement of simply living in reality, of acknowledging our place as creatures who own nothing before the Creator who owns everything. It's the baseline for discipleship.
Something to definitely wrestle with. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.